Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is conch shells. Back in the day when you heard someone blow a conch shell, you knew it was about to go down. So, first thing today, I'd say is a little thing I like to remind myself of is multiple things can be true. Sometimes if I'm arguing with someone or I see two people disputing something, I'm just kind of reminded that, multiple things can be true about a situation. Each person's some percent right. I didn't want to count Siegeman's win against Keys because Keys was sick. But, it turns out that Siegeman is playing incredible tennis. She shrugged after her straight set win against Sierra, but it really was nothing confusing about it. Siegeman hit her backhand with really good depth throughout. She was relentless with the drop shots. Sierra's a good mover, but the drop shot just scored on her frequently. It was really well produced. And Siegeman playing with such variety made it pretty tough to read. I'd point to the depth too. Siegeman's depth, just made the drop shot tougher to defend against. She hit her backhand really deep. She hits her forehand hard all the time, but, the backhand playing well just made it tricky. Sierra had some looks, but just defeated her by good quality tennis. It's a bit late for me to acknowledge Siegeman because she's probably on her way out. Playing the first seed is never great. Sabalanka has the most wins on tour this year. I think she has 46. Iga's in second with maybe 38. It might be 39 actually now that after she won today. Sabalanka can make herself look vulnerable at times, but she just played Mertens, and that's not good here. They had a very high-level match. Siegeman's approach is very slice-heavy. She uses a lot of depth and height and drop shots, and unfortunately, that's exactly what Mertens does. So, Sabalanka just played a better version of Siegeman here, I think. And, it really helps to play. If you play two lefties in a row, the second match, you're just really locked in on the right shots. So I think Siegeman will have success with the drop shot here because Sabalanka's balance is not really great when rushing forwards. But, she's just been played into form here for this. Sabalanka hit her backhand really well also in the match against Mertens. Mertens not really a title threat, but I think their match was one of the highest level matches of the fourth round. So, simple tennis analysis here. Arena's serving is a big weapon. I think, Siegeman's going to frustrate her. She might win, 2-3 games in a row. She has the tenacity, but this is a really big ask. And Sierra's in a different ballpark from Sabalenka right now. So I like Sabalenka in 2 solid sets. I don't know what solid means as far as scoreline. I just think, I think the quality of play will be really high. If Siegeman got 4-4, that would be a good result for her, I think. Anisimova, probably a Chenkova. Anisimova leads this head-to-head 3-0. Good chance for her to add another one here. She's playing really great tennis. Good enough that the announcers are starting to get on board. Take a little credit for discovering her. Credit goes to her, not them. And I feel like they're a bit late and a bit early. She was up a break in the first set against Noskova, something like 3-0, 3-1. And the announcers were talking about how, this tennis would assure her a finals weekend. It's a bit ridiculous to bypass multiple rounds based off a single break. Kind of shows, the reason it bothered me is it kind of shows you haven't been watching Noskova or Anisimova play. Anisimova is tremendous, but the lateral defending is not great. She's going to get scored on. She's a great ball striker and a good decision maker. That's why she wins. It's not, it's not comprehensive. It's not overwhelming. The offense is overwhelming, but she's not, invulnerable. So at the same time, Noskova tends to split sets with every good player she plays. She has the aggression, and the flat forehand, a good enough serve, and she just really lacks consistency. So, it's okay to speculate. Obviously, the announcers have to tell a story. I just think that, if you're not following along with the tour in general, I think sometimes the story you start to tell is the one you're looking at. And, if you look at a match and you look at your stance about it from, game to game, that's going to change several times during a match. So you really need to be, pretty locked in on these players' tendencies to, to make guesses. But I'll always just hate on announcers because, I want the job. Give me the job. Then I can be the person getting yelled at on a podcast. For now, Anisimova's through, and, she played well in the third set. It was really close. Could have gone either way. Noskova's a great player. She probably will continue to get better. I think Anisimova is just really good at resetting. It feels like in these shootouts, she's still able to play, in the final set, very aggressive and hit to very small targets. And sometimes her opponent might run out of ideas and start to just kind of, batter away. Pavs is a tough one for Anisimova. She's hitting her forehand cross court really well. She doesn't really do anything poorly. She hits the ball hard, the entire match. Tough match with Cartel. I don't think it. I could say it could have gone either way. I think Pavlyuchenkova was always a bit better. Cartel was trying to outlast her, and that doesn't really work against Pavs, because she hits so big. She doesn't have to go for the smallest target in the world to score. She can just hit to the open court, and the ball and the conditions are gonna make it work. I think the head-to-head issue is probably a result of her movement being a little bit slower than the pace of Amanda's shots. You can't really. Cartel tends to, telegraph a little bit, plays in kind of consistent cross-court patterns with her backhand. So Pavs is getting a chance to take full swings. With Anisimova, she's up against it. I think once you drag, on hard court, once you get dragged wide once for Pavs, she's in big trouble against Anisimova. On grass, I think that's kind of magnified. On the flip side, I think hard to play defense on grass for Anisimova too. So it could be really tough. It could be, a 3-setter here if Pavs gets going. I just think, Anisimova is playing near her peak. And, when she winds up in the tough spots, she's been managing her game. So I think she'll probably win, even if it goes the distance. Andreeva Benic, great one for the fans here. You're going to see a ton of long rallies. They're both playing excellent. Andreeva is always accurate, but I think, it just looked like she was playing a video game against Navaro. Just hitting the ball where she felt like it, and everything was landing deep. You're just pushing the B button, the C button, and, the ball is in a perfect loop. When she plays that way, it's easy to see how she's at the top of the tour. She can get out hit by some bigger hitters, but she's been, fortunate in this section of the draw that, it's been her against baseliners, and she's just in better form right now. She just kept the ball to Emma's backhand the whole match, but the depth was really solid. Emma was driving away. She had her usual style. Navaro usually dumps the first set, tends to drag people down in the second. She had some looks, but, Andreeva never dropped her level. She won the first 6-2 and just, stayed in. There, around the 2-up game, there were some chances for Navaro, but no, it was excellent play. It's interesting, too, because Andreeva, it reminds me a bit of Djokovic because her shots will vary in, the height and spin, but she'll maintain depth, and it seems like she's looking to do that more than anything else, and it's effective. It'll set up an interesting spot here against Benic, because Benic is looking to hug the baseline. She takes the ball early. She has really good half volleys. It's going to be a good match. I think it's a tough spot for Benic because so far, she's been playing offensive talents, and Benic has really been outlasting them by just being a bit more consistent. She outlasted Siegeman. She's a server, not really the best mover. Played Cocciaretto, server with big ground strokes. Belinda just kind of made it, a sprint drill back and forth until she was able to, get some errors late in the third set. And then, she finally beats Alexandrova on grass last round. Just kind of frustrated her, just defended and kept the ball in play until Alexandrova made errors. And Alexandrova can get frustrated and visibly so on the court. So, someone like Benic who's competing the whole time, has a good chance. I think those are better matchups for her than this one. Benic is the more consistent baseliner in those spots, and, she thrived on earning errors, exposing their movement. Lateral movement's none of their forte. Here, I think that advantage is gone. Benic is now the offense. She has to hit through her opponent, and I don't really like the chances. She's been more consistent than those players, but she hasn't been, at her peak yet. She's a little more error-prone in neutral rallies than Andreeva, and I think that's what will cost her what I expect to be a close match. Her taking the ball early, gives Andreeva a different look. Navaro was, hammering away, but not really hugging the baseline in that match. I just think, Andreeva's scramble is world-class. She moves really well. She's defending well. She's confident here. And I think she just wins by being the steady player from the baseline, So, Andreeva in two is what I expect. Could go three. Three starts to get scary, because Benic, has closed out. She might be a little physically stronger in the third set than Andreeva, but I just think it's hard for her to get there. I think it's going to be hard for her to score. And I think she doesn't have to make those neutral rally errors against the other players because she's playing defense. She's just looking to outlast them. Against Andreeva, you have to try to score. So, should be tough. Swiatek, Samsonova. It's half a surprise, for Samsonova to come through, but this is the right quarterfinal. They both played really well. They're both at their best, I think, right now on grass. Swiatek was pretty relentless against Towson today. Down a break in the first, but only dropped a single game in the second set. She's really rushing around the court right now. Not really in an error-prone manner, though. Iga's always trying to play at a furious pace. She's always trying to rush the ball, come up with a shot. But here, it just looks like she's found her timing. She's enjoying playing. She's able to play the way she wants to play, and that's, it's tough for a player who doesn't, Towson's not the best mover at the top level. So, Towson was just able to expose that, get some errors, and then Towson got frustrated. I don't know if Samsonova, gets as frustrated here, but going to be tricky. I think Samsonova has a bigger offense than Towson, honestly, and she's playing well. She was down a break early against Puzas Monero, but, she squeaked by 7-5 in the first set and then closed out the second similarly. I think Buzas being able to, frustrate her into some errors gives Swiatek a good chance. I like Samsonova's style for this matchup. Not saying she's going to win. Not saying like stylistically it's a huge issue, but she has lost to Swiatek in their recent meetings. But I just think Samsonova's looking to hit big on every shot, and that helps. Putting a little more into each swing buys you time because it's just so much harder to redirect on grass. At the same time, it's going to make you a little more error prone, but I don't think Samsonova's looking to grind with Swiatek, so when she gets a return, she should look to just crush the next one. That's been the style of players who were able to beat Iga is, big serve and just boom the ball. It's the same as, when Struff played Alcaraz and he just came to net all the time. It's the same, not the same tactic, but the same equation of, if they're much better than you from the baseline, just take that out of the equation, just play short points. I think Swiatek has the same level of defending as Buzas at least, and she's adding a pretty dynamic offense right now, so she should win. She's serving well, not great, but better than she had. She's coming to net often too, which I think will be useful against a player whose length can vary. I don't think Samsonova is going to come up with a match worth of passing shots while on the move. She just has very big strokes, and when she misses, it's deep or wide. Obviously that's the only two ways you can miss, but if you've watched her play, she can miss forehands by 3 feet, just if something is a little off with her swing. So I think if you make her move and you give her a small target, I think she's going to miss a bit. I don't think Iga has a quick route to the finish line. She's not the most effective returner. She's playing well, but Towson, a little hits a little lighter, I'd say, than Samsonova. Serves not quite as well either, and didn't really serve great today. So, it's just about staying focused and applying pressure for Iga, and she should win. I think also Iga has shown again, sometimes just a clay thing, but here once she's found a level, she was down a break early, but once she finds her level, she's been able to maintain it. And, I think that gives her an advantage here. I think she wins. Could be a 3-set battle, but I think, as the match extends, I think Swiatek maintains a level, and Samsonova is only really going to be able to win when she's peaking. So one thing I've found here is when it's over, I don't really know what to say. And it's really weird to just trail off.